Hi, good afternoon. I'm Bhadelia. I am the director of the BU Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases Policy and Research. And I'm here today with Dr. Richard Hatchett, who is the CEO of the Coalition for Epidemic Prevention Innovation. Richard, thank you so much for being here.
No, it's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Before we start, I wanted to give a little bit of a background. So some of you may be wondering, what is CEPI's role in this important moment and what is the work that they've been doing in pandemic preparedness? And just to share, since they were founded in 2017, CEPI is a global private and public partnership that focuses on research to develop vaccines and other biological countermeasures against priority infectious diseases that might be epidemic prone. And why this is important, as you say on your website, Richard, is that epidemics are vastly disruptive and they carry a human toll. And I think you estimate that COVID-19 could cost the global economy $4 trillion, or almost 5% of the GDP, global GDP, and that there isn't a market potential for these vaccines. And that's what you guys are trying to do. So their model of work has worked because the work that you did during COVID-19 vaccine yielded, and beforehand, yielded in many of the vaccines used during the pandemic, saving millions of lives. And not only that, but you participated in COVAX, which is the partnership that allowed more access to those vaccines globally to communities in low resource areas. So we're really lucky to have you. And one of the reasons I'm really, really happy, Richard, you're doing this is that this is part of the inaugural session of a new series we're doing at CEID called Director's Corner, which allows us to dig deep into a topic that we all care about, which is pandemic preparedness, and to do it in more depth and to address just-in-time sessions. So we're really, really happy to have you kick this off. So just a little bit more about Dr. Hatchett before we get started. Before taking his CEPI leadership role after its launch in 2017, Dr. Hatchett was the acting director of the U.S. Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA. Previously, he has also served under two U.S. presidents, both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, as the Director of Medical Preparedness Policy on Homeland and National Security Councils, during which time he was the principal author of the National Strategy for Pandemic Influenza Implementation Plan. He also has a medical degree from Vanderbilt and completed clinical training in internal medicine and medical oncology at Cornell and Duke universities. Richard, welcome.
Great. No, thank you for having me. It's great. I'm delighted to be here for the inaugural session.
You picked a good day to come to Boston. The weather is fantastic outside. All the more reason we appreciate you guys joining us. So let's just kick right in.
Okay.
So you guys launched in 2017, as I mentioned, and CEPI has played an integral role in COVID-19 vaccine development and the pandemic response. So now, moving out of this pandemic, where do you see CEPI moving? What is your focus? What is your vision for where you go from here?
Well, so CEPI, when we were established, before COVID, we were working on priority pathogens as identified by the World Health Organization. These were pathogens that had epidemic potential that did not have countermeasures and particularly did not have vaccines. So these were diseases like Lassa fever, Nipah, Rift Valley fever, chikungunya, and importantly, MERS. Then COVID happened, and we weren't even 3 years old as an organization when COVID emerged, and suddenly we faced a global pandemic threat, and we jumped in. We responded very quickly. I'm proud to say I think we read the tea leaves correctly and anticipated that we were facing what was really going to be a major global public health emergency. As we are emerging from the pandemic period, we have a couple of responsibilities. One, we now have another priority pathogen in COVID and coronaviruses more generally, where we need to have capabilities to be able to respond very quickly in case SARS-CoV-2 evolves or we encounter a new and theoretically potentially more dangerous coronavirus in the future. The other, we need to continue the work that we were doing on the pathogens that we were working on before. That work paused for several years, and we need to catch up. These are still epidemic threats that still have potential major regional impact and are threats that need to be addressed. And we also need to think about how to prepare more effectively to be able to respond more rapidly to future epidemics or pandemics that might emerge, while, and I think this is really important, while trying to help re-engineer the system so that it can produce more equitable outcomes than we observed during the response to the pandemic.
And what are some of the major programs or efforts that CEPI is doing currently that go toward that vision that you were thinking about?
Well, so again, it's a pretty wide array. And many of the vaccines that we were working on before COVID are now moving into field trials. And so we're having to gear up to support field trials and work with local country authorities to make sure those vaccines are the right vaccines for those populations, and that we're preparing a landing place for those vaccines if they're successful. That's one big focus of work. In the coronavirus space, we now are in a situation where the leading, COVID vaccines are being updated as new variants emerge, and that process has become relatively streamlined. So CEPI's focus in the coronavirus space is actually thinking about potential future threats, and we have made major investments starting as early as March of 2021, actually, in developing broadly protective coronavirus vaccines. A goal for us would be to develop this is probably technically beyond what's feasible, a pan-coronavirus vaccine. But if you can't have a pan-coronavirus vaccine, can you protect against the SARS beta coronaviruses that we know to be so dangerous? Can we have a pan-sarbecovirus vaccine? And so we've got a number of programs that we've initiated trying to develop those vaccines. In the preparing for future threats that we don't know what they are right now, we have talked a lot about, we have advocated for what we call the 100-day mission, which is to prepare to deliver new vaccines against novel threats in as little as 100 days from that threats emerging and being identified. That sounds potentially to people who understand, the history of vaccine development, that might sound preposterous. I think the technologies that we have evolved over the last couple of decades and which were validated during the pandemic actually make that possible if we make the right kinds of preparedness investments.
It's to address the rest of the system issues, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and then there's a whole other set of system issues that need to be addressed to make sure that those vaccines can be distributed fairly and rapidly to everyone.
So before I go on, I wanted to mention that at the end of our conversation, we'll be taking a couple of questions from our audience. So if you have questions, put them into the Zoom chat, and we'll have our colleague Cassandra, who's here in the room, share those questions with us. So as we're going along, please just think about what questions we want to ask Dr. Hatchett as well. So I'm going to stick to the 100-day mission, because I think the first time I heard about it, I said the same thing. There's just, having worked in at the last mile, a lot of outbreaks. Yeah, I know that a lot of this sort of breaks down by the time it gets to the front line, right? And so the idea that you could potentially get readiness at the country level for research to evaluate new products, develop those products, and then get it potentially tested for clinical efficacy seems it's a promising, and yet it's a goal that may be fraught with a lot of challenges. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is CEPI is sort of seen this as their mission goal, the big mission goal now moving forward. Have we made strides in this goal currently? And what part of the COVID response in particular, because there have been so many investments in so many ways, is potentially helping us move towards that? And then what are the existing challenges to the 100-day mission?
So we have made progress, and I'll illustrate that with a few examples in just a minute. I think the greatest enabler of progress has been the validation of the rapid response platforms like mRNA, several viral vector platforms, and even some protein-based platforms. The protein-based approaches were slower than the viral vector or the mRNA approaches, but we probably had half a dozen new vaccine production platforms that were validated during the pandemic, and they were all highly effective, all safe, with the COVID vaccines, and so that's a great enabler. I think we also had some proof of concept for an approach to being prepared to respond to new pathogens. This is a really important story. I don't know if everyone's really, how widely known this story is. But the reason we were able to deliver vaccines as quickly as we did was a combination of having technology platforms that had matured, certainly, but it was also a combination of prior investment in R&D, a prior investment in understanding how to develop vaccines against other coronaviruses, against SARS, against MERS. And it was the rapid adaptation of those concepts to SARS-CoV-2 when the sequences were released, and then the application of those concepts on the rapid response platforms that led to the very rapid generation of the vaccines. You talked about the challenges on the front lines, as it were. Recently, there was an outbreak of the Sudan virus. It's related to the Ebola virus. It's the filovirus. There was an outbreak of Sudan in Uganda, and there were Sudan vaccines that were under development, but none of them were ready for field trials. And so there was a sprint to take these vaccines, which had not been filled and finished and vialed and weren't ready for clinical trials, to see if we could get it. And the Sudan outbreak was enlarging and it was moving into multiple districts, and we weren't sure what direction the epidemic was going to take, to see how quickly we could get vaccines into the field and potentially into field trials or into use for containing the outbreak. At the same time, in Uganda, Makerere University, which is the major university in Kampala, had been conducting COVID vaccine trials. And so they had a clinical trial team that had conducted consecutive or sequential vaccine trials and was ready. And they pivoted very rapidly. This wasn't even a team that specialized in hemorrhagic fevers. This was actually a respiratory team. But they pivoted and they were ready by around day 65 or 70 to conduct field trials. The vaccines showed up on day 79. And fortunately, public health interventions had brought the epidemic under control, and the trials were never initiated. But that's the fastest that we've ever stood up to be ready to have clinical trials in a developing country and delivered vaccine to a developing country in the context of an outbreak. Doesn't quite meet the criteria for the 100-day mission, but it sets a new benchmark.
Well, let me ask you, because I think the audience may want to know this as well, is that what is the 100-day mission? Because we know it's articulated by CEPI, it's accepted as this vision by G7 and G20 and other countries. But what is the mission that needs to be accomplished in the 100 days? Well,
so what we are talking about with the 100-day mission is effectively the design of a vaccine, the production of a vaccine, and its testing in phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. So accumulating information on dosing and accumulating data around the safety and not the efficacy, but the immunogenicity of the vaccine. Does it produce an immune response? And in a crisis, we think that data could potentially, and I need to come back to the potentially, that's a really important, could potentially be sufficient for regulators to make a risk-benefit adjusted decision to allow emergency use authorization. So what you're talking about at day 100 is emergency use authorization of a new vaccine against a new virus. After day 100, there are a lot of things that would have to happen in the second 100 days. After day 100, you need to continue to collect information about efficacy, continue to collect information about safety, and you need to be scaling up production and making sure that you have mechanisms in place to actually deliver the vaccine if the epidemic has spread more broadly. When I said potentially deliver in 100 days, the regulators want to be very careful. They want to make sure that products are safe, that there is a high likelihood that they will be effective, and to be prepared to make those kinds of decisions with the comparatively limited data set that we're talking about. I think it will help the regulators if we have developed vaccines against related viruses on the same platforms and been able to provide, a dossier of information, both about whatever the vaccine platform, say mRNA, that we're using, and a dossier of information about related pathogens. And that's a years-long effort, and that's what needs to be done before we face the next pandemic.
Between epidemics, yeah. I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about what you started with, which is one of CEPI's mission being equity and access. I think that's just something you and I have talked about many times. It's, you know, close to the hearts of many who are watching this, and I think most of the world to sort of know about how we increase global equity and access. And the work that I did, so last year, as many of you may know, I was part of the White House COVID response team working on as a senior policy advisor for global COVID response. And I worked with Richard's team to have this conversation about the work that they're doing with COVAX as well as for future technologies. And I was so impressed by the way that CEPI thinks about some of the levers. So it's not, you know, late in the game with just the vaccine sharing, but you have a lot of levers that you put into your science, you put into the research development that you hope will yield better equity in the tail end. Can you talk a little bit about what those levers are and what your hopes are in the future?
Sure. And maybe quickly before I start, just to describe COVAX in case anybody's not familiar with it. COVAX was a global procurement mechanism that CEPI, Gavi, UNICEF, and WHO set up to procure vaccine, and CEPI's role was to support the R&D while we were developing the vaccines, and then to procure the vaccine, make sure it was allocated fairly and delivered effectively. COVAX was only partially successful. I mean, COVAX is now winding down, and we will have delivered just under 2 billion doses of vaccine to 146 different countries, but it didn't prevent inequities from emerging. And I think our observation, one quick observation about the inequities that we saw during the pandemic, and then I'll talk about how CEPI is tackling. The inequities that we saw emerge during the pandemic were a systems failure. And it, you know, initially inequity was driven by scarcity of vaccine. There just wasn't a lot of vaccine to go around. And so those with resources used their sharp elbows and got vaccine for their populations, leaving other people behind. But we solved the scarcity problem and there still wasn't equity. And then we solved the financing problem and there still wasn't equity. And then began to solve the delivery problem. And only gradually over almost 2 years did we begin to reduce the distributional inequities that we saw emerge. So to fix the equity problem, there's not a simple fix. You have to fix the system. And one of the problems that was embedded in the system was structural, which was the vaccine manufacturing was concentrated in just a few high population areas, and that's got to be fixed. So there's a lot of things that have to be tackled. And the way we at CEPI think about equity is instead of thinking about equitable distribution, as you say, as something to sort of tack on at the end and figure out once you have a product, I think you have to design for equity from the beginning. You've got to put equity, has to be a lens through which all of your decisions are considered. And, you know, is when you're faced with a choice in a development program, is it going to lead towards a product that can be distributed more equitably or not? And that starts with your contracting process, right? I mean, when you're setting up a partnership, the kinds of agreements that you can secure from potential partners can inform, you know, that whether equitable access is possible. They don't ensure it, and the kinds of choices you make about the products you develop. I mean, you have to think about is you know, does
product profiles?
Yeah, the target product profile. Does this product require, you know, a strenuous cold chain that may be difficult to implement in different countries? So we are trying to think about equity at every level of the development problem, and trying to think about how we can engage partners probably from much earlier in the development process than perhaps you might think, to help us, you know, steer towards equity from the beginning. But I'm not sure if that fully answers.
No, it does. And I think that, you know, some of the CEPI's been ahead of the curve in terms of how you even, as you talk about science, asking for open science, which I think for a lot of folks may not seem like an equity issue, but it is, because I mean, open science then allows sharing of those research findings with a lot more people, which of course is another element of equity. And the thing that I think is very interesting to me is the work that you've done also in ensuring that open science and access to product can be used for future science, right? I think, and that helps because as one of the reasons you were built is because there isn't as much commercial interest in these pathogens in creating this. And so that I've always found to be quite interesting. Let me change because we're running out of time. I want to ask you two more questions. So one thing that's close to both of our hearts that you and I had a lot of conversations about last year was Project NextGen, this idea, and you started talking about this. And the reason Richard was talking about sarbecoviruses or beta coronaviruses is that in the last 20-something years, we've had, 3 of these pathogens cause epidemics and pandemics, SARS-CoV-1, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome virus, as well as now SARS-CoV-2, which is the causative agent for COVID-19.
I would actually even say a fourth. I think HKU1 emerged in the 90s.
Yes, that's right. And so this is a bad news bears,
Right.
And the idea that you could create, let's just start with just COVID-19. I think the idea that we're in this quagmire where infections are still happening, even though we've disconnected infections from most of the horrible outcomes, as long as people stay up to date with their vaccines, right? But if you could create COVID-19 vaccines that give you longer duration protection, can give you potentially better protection, both from infections as well as disease, and also ones that actually are variant proof.
Yep.
You solving some of the issues that we're still facing in terms of what happens after infection, long COVID, all those other, questions that we've had. So that's one element of it. And you and CEPI have invested in next generation COVID-19 and coronavirus vaccines for a while now. I mean, a few years. Where are we with that science? I think everybody wants to know. Where are we with that science? What is close in the near horizon? What is far?
Okay, well, the first thing, one of the things that animates our investment is that we actually have biological proof of concept. And Lin-Fe Wang, who's a well-known researcher on coronaviruses and henipaviruses as well in Singapore, during the pandemic, made a really interesting choice to vaccinate SARS-CoV-1 survivors with the Pfizer vaccine, and then looked at the immune responses that were generated. So these were people that were infected with SARS back in 2004, right?
Yeah.
But what he found was that when he vaccinated those survivors, they had a very robust and broad immune response against not only SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2, but against a number of other sarbecoviruses. So he has demonstrated that it is possible to elicit from the human immune system a broadly protective immune response that protects against a wide range of sarbecoviruses. Obviously, we don't want to infect people with SARS to elicit that response. That's probably not where we want to go. The question is, can we elicit that response through vaccine technologies that we have and that are accessible to us? And basically, we have made a large series of investments. I think we've set aside around $230 million or something to that effect to support this work. And we invested initially in 13 different candidates. And some of those candidates were just focused on being SARS-CoV-2 variant, protective vaccines, and some were aiming more broadly. Where we are with the science, a couple of the projects have already flamed out, which is what you would expect. You have to anticipate failure. But we have other products. We have a partner at Caltech who has developed just a very interesting mosaic approach to delivering antigens from multiple SARS-related viruses, where we even have very promising primate data that suggests that it looks like there is a pathway to eliciting this response that we know is possible through vaccine-related methods. There's lots of challenges. It may be years before we have, a viable candidate that's going into late-stage clinical trials. And we're testing out a variety of concepts. A lot of the concepts relate to, presentation of multiple antigens on a single vaccine. There are approaches that are thinking about, can you elicit a broader response if you present more than just a spike antigen, but maybe other proteins within the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's not clear yet which is pathway is going to be the most successful. We are also in the process of developing. We're trying to think about the regulatory strategies and the manufacturing strategies for these vaccines as well. Some of them are going to be hard to manufacture in a reliable, repeatable way. How we would convince regulators to, authorize a broadly protective vaccine remains
Because
unclear.
we don't have concurrent pandemics going on.
We don't have concurrent pandemics
Yeah.
going on. We're with our partners at HERA, which is a countermeasures organization set up by the European Union. We're actually trying to set up a network of centers that are positioned to perform what are called controlled human infection models, or CHIM studies, which would potentially allow us to really probe and test. I mean, are these vaccines preventing transmission? Are they effective against more than one variant of SARS-CoV-2 or other coronaviruses that are currently circulating? So more to follow.
And it sounds like one of the things one of the reasons we talked about this so much last year is that, as you know, HHS and US government made a huge $5 billion investment in this project, NextGen. And this is one of the things that I was working on last year. And I'm curious to know if you think that the work that's being done there is being complementary in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it is being complementary, and it's complementary because the partners within the Department of Health and Human Services have worked very well with us. We actually sort of were co-thought partners with folks at NIH, folks at BARDA, certainly with you and colleagues at NSC and elsewhere, in terms of how we were conceptualizing the problem. And then BARDA, looked at what we've done. They've made a set of investments that are, not duplicative of our investments. We were delighted that the US government put those kinds of resources behind this problem. I mean, we feel very proud to have catalyzed, a tremendous amount of investment. And so we're very hopeful.
So I know we're running out of time. I think people will probably appreciate that we're running out of time. So I'm going to take the director's incentive here and ask you that last question. One of the things that I want to ask everybody who comes to this director's corner, because I think there's so many students and others who are starting the beginning of their career, is what drives you to do this work? I think for me, at least in the last 10 years, one of the bigger moments was my work in West Africa, the Ebola crisis, and serving as a physician in ETUs about standard of quality of care and access to medical countermeasures drives us. Is there a moment in your life or work that drives you?
Well, so I'm an oncologist by training.
Yes, I know. We talked about this. Yeah.
As you mentioned. So how I got lost on my way to the chemotherapy clinic and ended up, doing public health preparedness is a story in itself. And it's actually part of my inspiration. And I did have the opportunity. I was actually working in an emergency room in New York City on September the 11th and had to prepare for a stream of injured people. Never came. And then in the days after that, I ended up working at Ground Zero and working with other medical volunteers who spontaneously assembled without a lot of coordination from the city or other governmental authorities. And because we were all experiencing this attack in common and were facing an external threat, everybody was galvanized to work in the same direction and with a common sense of purpose. And it was, it was tremendously tragic and sad. And what we were doing was providing support to search and rescue workers, medical support to search and rescue workers. But it was tremendously inspiring. Mm. And one thing led to another, but I was invited with some work that I did afterwards. I'm thinking about how to organize medical volunteers to come down to Washington to help set up a program called the Medical Reserve Corps, which still exists and which I would encourage all of you to explore and volunteer for. But it also showed me that one of the walkaway lessons from that was that in a crisis, communities will come together. And I think we saw this certainly in the early days of COVID, which did become divisive over time. But the scientific community came together in an extraordinary and unprecedented way to do things that had never been done before, delivering countermeasures, faster than they had ever been developed before. And I am, one, inspired by that experience. I believe that, all of us can look at these viral threats as, outside of human society and something that we all face together. And the other thing that inspires me is that I think we actually have the technologies and now the tools and concepts that would enable us to dramatically mitigate, if not eliminate, these threats altogether. And so that's what keeps me going.
And that's why we're so glad you're here, Richard. Thank you for spending the time and thank you for always being a champion for trying to make this change in pandemic preparedness, which I know most of the CEID followers believe very closely it's a mission on and enjoy the rest of your visit in Boston. Thank you all for joining us.